In 1963, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service conducted a survey of bald eagle nesting pairs in the contiguous 48 states. The number they came back with was 417, not 417,000, not 41,700. 417 breeding pairs of bald eagles remaining across the entire continental United States, a country of nearly 4 million square miles, a country that had placed this bird on its national seal in 1782 as a symbol of power, freedom, and the particular kind of permanence that empires like to attribute to themselves. The survey did not make major news. There was no national emergency declared. The number was noted in scientific literature and in the quiet corridors of federal wildlife management, where people who understood what it meant understood it with the specific dread that comes from recognizing a trajectory rather than a data point. A trajectory that, if it continued in the direction it was moving, ended in one place and one place only. That trajectory did not continue. What happened instead is one of the most remarkable wildlife recoveries in the documented history of conservation biology anywhere on Earth. Today, the bald eagle population in the contiguous United States is estimated at approximately 316,700 individual birds, representing roughly 71,400 nesting pairs. The population has not merely recovered, it has expanded beyond ranges the species occupied before European colonization, colonized habitat types its ancestors never used, and done so with a speed and completeness that has surprised even the biologists who spent decades working toward exactly this outcome. If you spend time in the right places, and increasingly in places that used to be the wrong places, you can watch a bald eagle hunt. You can watch it stoop toward water, extend its feet, and take a fish from the surface with a kind of casual authority that makes it clear the bird is not trying particularly hard. You can watch it carry that fish to a perch and consume it, while ignoring the humans watching from below with a disregard that is itself a data point about how much has changed. If you have found this, and you want to understand wild ecosystems honestly, with the same rigor and the same willingness to sit with complicated answers that the subject demands, subscribe now. What follows is going to require both. The number 417 deserves to be held for a moment before anything else is discussed, because it is the kind of number that does not communicate its own meaning without context. And the context is staggering. The bald eagle was not always rare. It was not marginally common or regionally restricted before European colonization of North America. By the best estimates of ornithologists working from historical records, population modeling, and comparison with surviving populations, the bald eagle population in North America at the time of first European contact numbered somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 individuals. Some estimates push higher. The species nested along virtually every major waterway on the continent. It was documented in extraordinary concentrations along salmon rivers in the Pacific Northwest, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, along the Mississippi and its major tributaries, around the Great Lakes, along the Atlantic coast from Florida to Maine, and in concentrations along the Gulf Coast that early European naturalists described with a specificity that makes modern readers understand they were witnessing something that no longer exists to be witnessed in that form. Benjamin Franklin's famous objection to the bald eagle as national symbol, that it was a bird of bad moral character that obtained its food by robbery and that the turkey would have been a more honorable choice, was not an observation about a rare or struggling species. It was an observation about a common, frequently visible, behaviorally conspicuous bird that Franklin had apparently watched steal fish from ospreys on enough occasions to form an opinion about its character. The bald eagle was not an icon of rarity when it became a national symbol. It was an icon of presence, of abundance, of the particular quality that apex predators have when they are functioning normally within intact ecosystems. The bird was everywhere that water and fish were, and water and fish were everywhere. What happened between 1782 and 1963 was not a single event. It was a cascade of pressures applied from multiple directions simultaneously over nearly 2 centuries, each of which would have been damaging on its own, and which in combination produced a decline so severe that 417 was the number that remained. The first and most sustained pressure was direct killing. The bald eagle was shot, trapped, and poisoned throughout the 18th and 19th centuries by a livestock farming culture that blamed it for predation on lambs, piglets, and poultry. The predation was real in some cases and exaggerated in most others, but the distinction was largely academic, in a cultural context that viewed large predators as competitors to be eliminated rather than components of ecosystems to be managed. Federal protection for the bald eagle did not arrive until 1940, with the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, and even then, enforcement was inconsistent, and penalties were modest enough that illegal killing continued, with limited deterrence. Between European settlement and the middle of the 20th century, millions of bald eagles were killed directly by humans. Millions is not hyperbole. It is the order of magnitude that ornithologists working on historical population reconstruction have arrived at from the evidence. The second pressure was habitat destruction. The bald eagle is, at its core, a waterway bird. It nests in large trees near water. It hunts primarily aquatic prey, fish above all else, supplemented by waterfowl, turtles, and carrion. It requires specific structural features in its nesting trees, specifically large diameter trunks capable of supporting the massive nests the species builds and reuses over decades, adding material each year until the structures become engineering marvels of organic construction that can weigh a ton or more and are among the largest bird nests in the world. The clearing of old-growth forest along American waterways throughout the 18th and 19th centuries removed nesting substrate at a scale that directly constrained the eagle population. The drainage of wetlands for agriculture, the damming of rivers for power and flood control, and the industrial pollution of waterways that accompanied the growth of the American manufacturing economy all attacked the prey base that eagles depended on. A river too polluted for fish to live in is a river without eagles. By the middle of the 20th century, a substantial proportion of American rivers fell into that category. But the final blow, the one that took a depleted and habitat-stressed population and pushed it toward the edge of functional extinction, was chemical. DDT, dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane, was introduced as an agricultural and public health insecticide in the United States in the mid-1940s, and was applied with a thoroughness and an optimism about its safety that now reads as almost incomprehensible. It was sprayed on crops, on wetlands, on forests being managed for gypsy moth and other pest species, and it entered aquatic food chains with a specificity of impact that was not understood until it had been doing damage for years. DDT itself degrades in the environment, but its primary breakdown product, DDE, does not degrade readily and bioaccumulates through food chains in a process called biomagnification. Each trophic level concentrates the compound relative to the level below it. Zooplankton absorb DDE from contaminated water. Small fish eat millions of zooplankton and accumulate DDE in their tissues at concentrations many times higher than the water they live in. Larger fish eat smaller fish and concentrate DDE further. Bald eagles, sitting at the top of aquatic food chains and eating large quantities of contaminated fish daily, accumulated DDE at concentrations that were, in some measured individuals, hundreds of thousands of times higher than the concentration in the water the fish had come from. The mechanism by which DDE killed eagles was not by poisoning adults directly, though it did impair physiology in other ways. It was by disrupting calcium metabolism in females during egg production. DDE interferes with the hormonal signaling that controls the deposition of calcium carbonate in eggshells, producing eggs with shells so thin that the weight of the incubating parent crushes them. Eagles that were physiologically normal in every observable respect, that were hunting successfully, that had established territories and built nests, and bonded with mates, and copulated and laid eggs in the sequence that had produced eagle populations for millions of years, were producing eggs that did not hatch. They were incubating crushed shells. The reproductive failure was invisible from the outside and catastrophic in its effects. A species that does not reproduce does not need to be killed to be eliminated. It simply needs to be prevented from replacing itself for long enough that the existing population ages out of reproductive viability. The math of eggshell thinning, when applied to a population already reduced by 2 centuries of direct killing and habitat loss, produced the number 417. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, is the book most associated with the public recognition of what DDT was doing to bird populations, and it deserves its reputation as one of the most consequential works of popular science ever written in the United States. Carson did not discover the science of biomagnification or eggshell thinning. Those phenomena were being documented by ornithologists and wildlife biologists in the years before her book appeared. What she did was translate that science into language that a general audience could receive without prior training, and she did it with a moral seriousness and a narrative clarity that made the information impossible to ignore in the way that scientific journal articles, however important, typically are. The book was attacked viciously by the chemical industry and by agricultural interests, who recognized correctly that its implications threatened a profitable and established part of their business. It was defended by scientists who recognized that its core claims were accurate, and that the attacks on it were not engaging with the evidence, but with the threat it posed to commercial interests. The public debate that followed was messy and protracted, as public debates about science usually are. But its outcome, the eventual prohibition of DDT in the United States in 1972 under the newly created Environmental Protection Agency, was decisive. The prohibition of DDT alone would not have saved the bald eagle. A population of 417 breeding pairs does not recover on its own without additional intervention when the habitat pressures that contributed to its decline remain in place, and when its rate of reproduction is insufficient to offset ongoing mortality from other causes. What followed the DDT ban was a set of parallel interventions that, together, created the conditions for the recovery that occurred. The Endangered Species Act of 1973, signed into law by Richard Nixon in a moment of bipartisan environmental commitment that is almost impossible to imagine in the current political landscape, listed the bald eagle as endangered throughout the lower 48 states and provided the legal framework for habitat protection and recovery planning that gave the species the space it needed. Captive breeding programs, which took eggs from wild nests, hatched them under controlled conditions, and returned the chicks to the wild, addressed the reproductive bottleneck that thin-shelled eggs had created. Hacking programs, which raised young eagles in towers in suitable habitat and conditioned them to return to those areas as adults, introduced the species into ranges from which it had been absent for decades. Lead shot restrictions, which reduced the ingestion of toxic fragments by eagles scavenging gut piles and carcasses left by hunters, addressed one of the ongoing mortality factors that DDT prohibition had not touched. And the Clean Water Act of 1972, which established regulatory frameworks for the discharge of pollutants into American waterways, began the slow process of allowing fish populations in degraded rivers and lakes to recover. Fish are the foundation of everything the bald eagle is ecologically. Without fish, there are no eagles. With fish, in sufficient abundance in accessible water, eagles follow. The recovery of fish populations in rivers and lakes across the eastern United States through the 1970s and 1980s, while incomplete and ongoing, was significant enough to restore the prey base in areas where eagles began to recolonize. The combination of recovered prey, reduced direct mortality, legal habitat protection, and the supplemental population support provided by captive breeding and hacking produced a trajectory that bent upward with a steepness that surprised almost everyone who was not working at the daily operational level of the recovery effort. The recovery did not happen uniformly. It happened fastest in areas where the combination of good water quality, large nesting trees, and reduced human disturbance was available simultaneously. The Chesapeake Bay watershed, which had been the heart of the bald eagle's Atlantic coast range before its collapse, became one of the recovery's earliest and most visible success stories. The Great Lakes region, the Pacific Northwest, Florida, Alaska, all of these areas saw eagle populations expand during the 1980s and 1990s, at rates that required biologists to revise their recovery models upward repeatedly. The species was removed from the endangered list in 1995, reclassified as threatened, and then delisted entirely in 2007, a regulatory progression that tracked the actual population numbers closely enough to suggest that the listing and delisting process was, in this instance, responding to genuine biological reality rather than political pressure. The 2007 delisting was accompanied by continued protection under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, which maintained the legal prohibition on killing, disturbing, or possessing eagles or their nests and eggs, regardless of their listing status under the Endangered Species Act. The population has continued to grow since delisting. The 2020 survey that produced the 316,700 individual estimate represented a near doubling of the population from a 2009 survey that had found approximately 143,000 individuals. The growth rate has been sustained. The species is not merely recovered. It is, by any reasonable biological standard, thriving. Eagles have established nesting territories in states where the species had been absent for a century. They have nested in urban and suburban areas in ways that their predecessors did not, adapting to the structural features of human-modified landscapes with a flexibility that reflects both the species' behavioral plasticity and the degree to which the basic ecological requirements, large water, abundant fish, suitable nest sites, have become available in places they were not available a generation ago. There are now bald eagle nests in every continental state except Hawaii. There are nests visible from interstates. There are nests in city parks. There are nests near airports. There are eagles that have become so accustomed to human presence that they hunt in the middle of the day in full view of crowds of people who stop and watch them with their phones out. This is where the story becomes complicated, not in the way that conservation failures are complicated, which is straightforwardly sad, in the way that conservation successes are complicated, which is stranger and more interesting and requires more honest thinking to navigate. A species that recovers from near extinction and becomes abundant again does not simply restore the ecological conditions that existed before its decline. It enters a landscape that has been changed in the decades of its absence, and it changes that landscape in turn. It occupies ecological space, creates pressures on prey populations, interacts with competitors and prey species in ways that those species, having lived for decades without the full pressure of a functional eagle population, are now encountering with varying degrees of evolutionary and behavioral preparation. The ecosystem that the bald eagle is returning to is not the ecosystem it left, and the bald eagle that is returning, in these numbers, to these landscapes, is not doing nothing to those ecosystems. It is reshaping them in ways that are, in some respects, exactly what was intended by the people who worked to bring the species back, and in other respects, are creating dynamics that those same people are still working to understand. The most direct ecological impact of the bald eagle's recovery is on fish populations, which are the foundation of the eagle's diet across most of its range. An adult bald eagle requires roughly 1 to 2 pounds of food per day to maintain its body weight and energy budget. Fish constitute the majority of that intake in most habitats, supplemented by waterfowl, small mammals, and carrion in seasons or areas where fish are less available. A bald eagle population of 316,000 individuals, even accounting for juveniles and subadults that are less efficient hunters and more dependent on carrion and opportunistic feeding, represents an enormous and recently restored predatory pressure on fish populations across the continent. Quantifying that pressure precisely is difficult because eagle foraging behavior is distributed across thousands of water bodies of vastly different productivity, and because the fish populations themselves are dynamic, but the directional impact is not ambiguous. Eagles take fish. Many eagles take many fish. The fish populations of rivers and lakes that host large eagle concentrations are experiencing predation pressure from eagles at levels that have not existed in those systems for decades, in some cases for a century or more. In most contexts, this is ecologically unremarkable. Fish and eagles coexisted for millions of years before European colonization changed both the eagle and the fish populations simultaneously, and the prey populations that sustained the historical eagle abundance were productive enough to absorb the predation. The fish are not passive, they reproduce. A healthy fish population in productive water can sustain significant predatory pressure from eagles without undergoing decline, because the predation removes individuals but does not necessarily reduce the reproductive capacity of the population if the population is otherwise healthy. This is the basic logic of sustainable predation, and it holds in most systems under most conditions. The complication arises in systems where the fish populations themselves are not fully recovered, where they are being maintained at reduced levels by factors other than eagle predation, or where specific components of fish populations, specific age classes, specific species, specific spawning assemblages are sufficiently concentrated and vulnerable during specific periods that eagle predation becomes a meaningful constraint on their ability to maintain or grow their populations. Salmon are the clearest and most intensively studied case where this complication becomes concrete. Bald eagles have a deep evolutionary and ecological relationship with Pacific salmon that is one of the great predator-prey stories of the temperate world. Eagles concentrate at salmon rivers during spawning runs, in numbers that reflect the extraordinary abundance of an easy, nutritionally rich food source. The spectacle of eagles gathering on salmon streams, hundreds in some locations, is one of the most dramatic wildlife viewing experiences available in North America, and draws enormous numbers of ecotourism visitors to places like the Chilkat Bald Eagle Preserve in Alaska, where winter concentrations of several thousand eagles have been documented feeding on the last-to-spawn chum salmon runs. The relationship is ancient. Eagles have been exploiting Pacific salmon spawning runs for as long as both species have existed in the Pacific Northwest. The salmon evolved under eagle predation. The eagles are part of the ecological context within which Pacific salmon populations developed. But Pacific salmon populations are not in the same condition they were when that evolutionary relationship developed. Multiple salmon species, including Chinook, coho, sockeye, steelhead, and others, have been listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act across portions of their range in the Pacific Northwest and California. The factors driving salmon decline are many and well documented. Hydroelectric dams that block spawning migrations, water extraction for agriculture, logging that increases sediment and water temperature in spawning streams, hatchery practices that reduce the genetic diversity and wild adapted fitness of spawning populations, and ocean conditions driven by climate change that reduce the survival of salmon in their marine phase. Eagle predation is not the cause of salmon population challenges. It is not even a major cause, but in the context of populations that are already stressed by these other factors, predation by a recovering eagle population is a variable that salmon biologists are now incorporating into their population models in ways that they did not need to do when the eagle population was a fraction of its current size. The specific concern is not with eagles taking salmon on spawning streams in the Pacific Northwest, where the salmon that reach the streams have survived the marine phase and the spawning run and are, in many cases, already post-spawn individuals that have completed their reproductive function and are going to die regardless of whether an eagle takes them. Eagles taking post-spawn salmon are functioning as efficient cleanup agents in a riparian ecosystem that depends on marine-derived nutrients being transferred from salmon carcasses into the surrounding forest through the work of scavengers. Eagles, bears, wolves, ravens, and the many other species that feed on salmon carcasses are the mechanism by which the ocean's productivity is carried into the interior of the Pacific Northwest forest and distributed across a landscape that is fundamentally shaped by the salmon nutrient cycle. This is not predation in any ecologically problematic sense. This is the most important nutrient transfer process in one of the most productive temperate ecosystems on Earth, and the recovery of the eagle to full participation in it is a restoration of function that ecologists have celebrated for good reason. The concern focuses more narrowly on situations where eagles are taking live juvenile salmon, specifically smolts migrating downstream toward the ocean, in rivers and estuaries where the population of juvenile salmon is already reduced by other factors, and where every individual that makes it to the ocean represents a meaningful proportion of the reproductive potential of an already diminished cohort. In these situations, the question of whether eagle predation represents additive mortality, meaning it removes individuals that would otherwise have survived to the ocean, or compensatory mortality, meaning it removes individuals that would have died from other causes anyway and therefore does not reduce the population's overall productivity, is not a rhetorical question. It is a quantitative one, with real implications for salmon population management and for the potential conflict between eagle recovery and salmon recovery as simultaneous conservation objectives. The research on this question produces answers that vary by river system, by salmon species, by the density of eagle concentrations at specific pinch points in migratory routes, and by the abundance of alternative prey that diverts eagle predation pressure away from salmon at critical times. The aggregate picture from the available science does not support the conclusion that eagle predation is preventing salmon recovery at the scale of entire populations. The factors driving salmon decline are far larger in aggregate effect than eagle predation. But the research does not support dismissing the question either. In specific systems, at specific times, with specific population sizes, eagle predation is a real variable that affects the survival rate of juvenile salmon in ways that matter to the management of those populations. The simultaneous recovery of eagles and the simultaneous conservation effort for salmon are, in some geographies, pulling in directions that require careful quantitative thinking to navigate. The story of two charismatic species, both recovered from human-caused decline, coexisting happily, is a satisfying narrative. The reality is more complex and more interesting than that narrative. The impact of eagle recovery on waterfowl populations presents a similarly layered picture. Bald eagles are significant predators and pirating agents of waterfowl across much of their range, taking ducks, geese, and coots directly and forcing other predators and scavengers off their kills and caches, with the authority that comes from being the largest and most dominant aerial predator in most of the systems they inhabit. The relationship between eagle abundance and waterfowl population dynamics was studied extensively in areas where eagle concentrations were historically high, primarily Alaska and British Columbia, and the findings from those systems established that eagle predation was a real but typically compensatory mortality source in healthy waterfowl populations, removing individuals that were already vulnerable from other causes and therefore not substantially reducing the reproductive output of populations. The recovery of eagle populations across the contiguous United States, including in areas where waterfowl management for sport hunting has been a long-standing and intensively managed priority, has introduced eagle predation pressure into systems where it had been largely absent for decades. Waterfowl managers in some states are now grappling with eagle predation rates on managed wetlands, particularly during winter concentration periods when both eagles and waterfowl concentrate on the productive wetland systems that state and federal agencies manage for waterfowl hunting. The conflict is real enough to have generated formal discussions between eagle conservation advocates and waterfowl hunting interests, though the regulatory framework of the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act severely constrains the management options available when eagles and waterfowl management objectives conflict. Eagles cannot be killed, hazed effectively without significant investment, or excluded from waterfowl productive wetlands without major structural interventions. The hunting community's frustration with eagle predation on waterfowl in managed wetlands is a genuine and understandable response to watching a legally protected species remove animals that recreational and subsistence hunters have invested in through license fees, excise taxes on equipment, and habitat acquisition funding. The emotional and economic logic of that frustration is not difficult to follow, even when the regulatory and conservation logic that constrains the management response is equally clear. The eagle's impact on colonial waterbird nesting is among the least publicly discussed and most ecologically significant dimensions of the recovery's downstream effects. Bald eagles are highly opportunistic nest predators and pirating specialists that can exert severe pressure on colonial waterbird nesting colonies when they concentrate near them. Great blue herons, great egrets, double-crested cormorants, snowy egrets, black-crowned night herons, and other colonial waterbirds that nest in large aggregations near productive waterways are all vulnerable to eagle disturbance and predation, in ways that produce colony abandonment at a regularity that has surprised ornithologists studying waterbird population dynamics in the years since eagle populations reached significant densities in previously depleted ranges. The mechanism is not always direct predation. Often, it is something subtler and more systemically damaging. An eagle that flies over or perches near a colonial waterbird nesting colony provokes a panic response in the nesting birds, a mass flushing that leaves eggs and small chicks exposed to temperature extremes and to secondary predators that move through the disturbance zone. Repeated disturbance events over a nesting season can reduce reproductive success in colonial waterbird colonies substantially, without any eagle ever directly taking a chick or an egg. The eagles are not targeting the colonies. They are using the habitat near the colonies because the habitat is productive for foraging, and because large trees near water are suitable as perch sites. The disturbance to the colonial waterbirds is incidental from the eagle's perspective, and devastating in its effects from the nesting colony's perspective. The double-crested cormorant is the species most frequently cited in this context, not because it is the most vulnerable to eagle disturbance, but because its relationship with eagle recovery has become the most politically and ecologically complex. Cormorants are fish-eating waterbirds that recovered substantially from their own DDT-induced population crash in the mid-20th century, and whose population growth in the Great Lakes region in particular generated intense controversy among sport fishing interests, who blamed cormorant predation for declines in yellow perch and walleye in managed fisheries. The cormorant became, In the 1990s and 2000s, a lightning rod for conflicts between waterbird conservation and sport fishing management. And federal agencies authorized lethal control programs that killed hundreds of thousands of cormorants in the Great Lakes and other regions to reduce predation pressure on commercially and recreationally important fish species. The science supporting the assertion that cormorant predation was the primary driver of fish population declines in affected areas was contested by ornithologists and generally found to be weaker than fishing interests claimed, but the political pressure was sufficient to produce management action. Now, the cormorant population in the Great Lakes and Upper Midwest is being subjected to significant pressure from recovering bald eagle populations that are disturbing nesting colonies at a scale and frequency that is producing measurable reproductive failure in affected colonies. The same fishing interests that sought cormorant control as a management tool for fish populations are watching eagles disrupt cormorant colonies with a complicated set of reactions that includes, in some cases, a satisfaction that the eagle is doing what expensive and politically contentious management programs did, and in other cases, a concern that the cormorant population crash, driven by eagle disturbance, may itself produce ecological instability in the waterbird communities of the Great Lakes region. The ecological irony of a conservation success story, the bald eagle, exerting pressure on another conservation success story, the recovering cormorant, in a manner that produces outcomes that some stakeholders sought through lethal management programs they could not politically sustain, is the kind of outcome that ecosystem dynamics produce with a regularity that should humble anyone who believes that wildlife management is primarily a problem of determining what outcomes are desired, and then implementing the technical interventions to produce them. Ecosystems are not managed. They are perturbed, and they respond in ways that include the intended consequences and many unintended ones. The food web effects of eagle recovery extend beyond the direct predator-prey relationships that are most easily observed and quantified. The bald eagle, as a dominant apex predator and kleptoparasite, reshapes the behavior of other species simply by being present in high numbers through a set of processes that ecologists group under the umbrella term of the landscape of fear. The landscape of fear is the spatial and behavioral map that prey species and subordinate predators maintain of areas where predation risk is elevated, and it shapes foraging behavior, habitat use, and movement patterns in ways that have cascading effects through the food web far beyond what is captured by counts of predator-prey interactions. When eagles are abundant at a wetland, the waterfowl using that wetland spend more time scanning for predators and less time foraging. They change the microhabitats they use, favoring areas with visual cover or open sightlines, depending on their specific behavioral strategies for predator avoidance. They may shift their timing of activity, moving away from times and places where eagle activity is most concentrated. The aggregate effect of these behavioral modifications on waterfowl energy budgets, habitat use, and movement patterns is real and measurable, and it filters through the food web into the prey of the waterfowl. The emergent insects and aquatic invertebrates and submerged vegetation that would be grazed or harvested more intensively in a landscape with fewer eagles. The same landscape of fear effects operate on mammalian species that eagles prey upon. Muskrats, rabbits, squirrels, and juvenile mammals of many species are taken by bald eagles in areas where aquatic prey is seasonally reduced, and the predation risk that eagle presence imposes on these species shapes their habitat use, their foraging timing, and their breeding strategies in ways that have not been comprehensively studied at the scale of the recovering eagle population, but that are real based on what is known about predator-mediated behavior modification in mammal communities generally. The eagle does not simply take fish and waterfowl. It reorganizes the behavioral ecology of every species within its predatory reach, and in doing so, it reorganizes the food webs that those species are embedded in. The kleptoparasitic behavior of the bald eagle, which is the technical term for the habit of stealing food from other predators and scavengers rather than killing prey directly, is an ecological impact vector that deserves separate treatment because of its effects on the species that eagles most commonly pirate. Ospreys are the primary victims of eagle kleptoparasitism in most of the eagle's range, and the relationship is specific enough and well documented enough to represent a genuine ecological interaction with population-level consequences for the osprey. Ospreys are specialized fish hunters that dive feet first into water to take fish from near the surface, a hunting method that eagles cannot replicate directly. Eagles cannot plunge dive. They take fish from the water surface in a shallow swoop that captures near-surface or surfacing fish, but cannot reach the fish at depth that ospreys are capable of taking. Eagles and ospreys, therefore, are not direct competitors for fish in most situations, but they overlap extensively in habitat use, and eagles have learned to intercept ospreys carrying fish to their nests or feeding perches and force them to drop the fish, which the eagle then catches or retrieves. The harassment behavior, which involves aerial pursuit of the osprey and sustained pressure until the osprey drops its catch, is energetically costly for both birds, but disproportionately costly for the osprey, which has already invested the energy of a dive and a fish capture. In areas where eagle density is high, relative to the number of ospreys using the same water bodies, the kleptoparasitic pressure can substantially reduce the energy available to osprey nesting pairs for chick provisioning, with measurable effects on osprey reproductive success in those areas. Osprey populations are generally healthy and have themselves recovered well from the DDT era, so the current impact of eagle kleptoparasitism is not producing osprey population decline at scales that register as conservation emergencies. But in specific localities where eagle concentrations are unusually high and ospreys are the dominant fish-hunting bird, the interaction is depressing osprey productivity in ways that researchers are now documenting with a frequency that reflects the new reality of high eagle densities across the eastern United States and the Pacific Northwest. The nutrient transfer function that bald eagles perform, particularly in their role as consumers and distributors of carrion, represents one of the most ecologically important and least popularly appreciated aspects of what the eagle recovery means for North American ecosystems. Eagles are significant scavengers in virtually all the ecosystems they occupy. They consume roadkill, hunter-shot carcasses, winter-killed deer and elk, fish killed by disease or spawning stress, and marine mammals washed ashore on coastal beaches. In performing this function at the scale of a population of 316,000 birds, they are conducting an enormous amount of nutrient cycling work that removes disease vectors, accelerates the decomposition and redistribution of organic matter, and maintains the carrion processing capacity of ecosystems that in many regions of the country have lost other major carrion specialists, specifically wolves and other large predators, from the historical suite of species that performed this function. The relationship between eagle abundance and lead toxicity represents a collision between the eagle's scavenging function and a persistent source of human-caused mortality that has been one of the most contentious issues in eagle conservation since the early years of the recovery. Eagles that scavenge gut piles and carcasses left by hunters in areas where lead-core rifle ammunition and lead shot are used ingest fragments of lead projectiles that fragment extensively on impact with bone and tissue. Lead fragments in gut piles are small, numerous, and widely distributed through the carcass material that eagles consume. The toxicology of lead ingestion in eagles is well established. Lead is a potent neurotoxin that impairs neurological function at low concentrations, disrupts coordination, and causes death at higher concentrations. Lead poisoning is documented as a significant mortality cause in bald eagles across their range, particularly in the fall and winter hunting seasons, when gut pile availability peaks. Blood lead levels in bald eagles, sampled in areas of high hunting activity during hunting seasons, are frequently in ranges that indicate recent exposure, and a proportion of the birds examined show levels consistent with acute or chronic clinical toxicity. The adoption of non-lead ammunition by hunters, which has been advanced by both voluntary programs and mandatory regulations in some states and federal lands, is the primary mitigation strategy available for this mortality source. California mandated non-lead ammunition for hunting statewide in 2019, a regulation that was supported by extensive data on lead exposure in California condors and golden eagles, and that has been followed with interest by other states considering similar measures. The hunting community's response to non-lead ammunition mandates has been divided, with some hunters embracing the change as consistent with their conservation values, and others objecting on grounds of cost, performance, and the precedent of regulatory interference in hunting practices. The debate about lead ammunition is not primarily a debate about eagles. It is a debate about hunter autonomy and regulatory reach that happens to have eagles, condors, and other scavenging raptors as its primary stakeholders. The ecological stakes for eagle populations, which are experiencing ongoing annual mortality from a preventable source at a scale that is not trivial in the context of maintaining population health, are clear in the scientific literature, if not always in the political conversation. The eagle's expansion into urban and suburban environments is one of the most striking and socially significant dimensions of the recovery, and it is producing ecological and social dynamics that are genuinely novel in the history of the species. Bald eagles are nesting in proximity to human development at a scale and in a range of contexts that their ancestors did not, and the behavioral adaptations required for that nesting success include a tolerance for human disturbance, artificial lighting, noise, and structural modifications to the landscape that represent a genuine expansion of the ecological niche the species occupies. Eagles nesting near airports, along suburban waterways, in city parks adjacent to residential neighborhoods, are demonstrating a behavioral plasticity that was not evident in the species during the low abundance decades when surviving populations were concentrated in the most remote and least human-disturbed habitats available. The urban eagle is a different animal in its ecological relationships than its wilderness counterpart, not in its biology, but in the resources it draws on and the impacts it creates. Urban eagles have access to a different prey base than rural ones. They eat more waterfowl and less salmon. They eat more fish from managed urban water bodies, including stocked recreational fishing ponds and urban lakes managed for community amenity value, where fish density is artificially maintained at levels that wild systems rarely produce. They eat more mammals, including domestic cats and small dogs that are simply not available as prey in wilderness systems. The documentation of eagles taking domestic cats is well established in communities where eagle nesting has occurred adjacent to residential areas. The documentation of eagles taking small dogs is less extensive, but not absent. The social response to these events, which is intense and immediate in communities where they occur, is a compressed version of the broader conflict between wildlife recovery and human land use that plays out at larger scales across the continent. The urban eagle also operates in a landscape of extraordinary artificial resource concentration. Urban water bodies are often warmer than natural systems, which keeps them ice-free longer and maintains accessible fish through winter periods when wild water bodies in the same latitude would be frozen. Stormwater inputs into urban water bodies create nutrient loading that can produce high fish productivity. Landscaping near urban water bodies often maintains the large trees that eagles prefer for nesting, and perching at a density that is higher in some suburban contexts than in natural riparian systems that have experienced timber harvest. The urban landscape is not obviously suitable eagle habitat, but the specific combination of accessible water, high fish density, large perch and nest trees, and reduced interference from ground predators that might access eagle nests makes some urban environments surprisingly productive for eagles, and the growing number of eagle nesting attempts in urban contexts is not a function of the best habitat being saturated and eagles settling for second best. In some cases, the urban sites are genuinely competitive with natural sites in the metrics that determine eagle nesting success. The social and cultural dimensions of the eagle's recovery are inseparable from any honest assessment of what the recovery means. The bald eagle occupies a position in American cultural imagination that no other wild animal shares. It is simultaneously a national symbol, a conservation symbol, a spiritual figure in many indigenous traditions, and an object of widespread public affection that transcends the cultural and political divisions that make agreement about most wildlife management questions nearly impossible. The recovery of the bald eagle is one of the few conservation outcomes that has generated genuine, sustained, bipartisan celebration in the United States. It is cited in wildlife agency communications, political speeches, environmental advocacy materials, and hunting community publications with equal enthusiasm and almost uniform pride. The eagle is the story that everyone can agree on, which is part of why it has been allowed to remain a relatively uncomplicated story in public discourse. The complication is not that the eagle's recovery is a bad thing. It is emphatically not a bad thing. The complication is that the uncomplicated celebration of the recovery elides the ecological consequences of having 316,000 large apex predators functioning in landscapes that spent decades without them, and that elision makes it harder to have the honest, quantitative, scientifically grounded conversations about management, trade-offs, and ecosystem dynamics that the recovery requires at this stage. The eagle is no longer fragile. It no longer needs the protection of strategic communication that softened or deferred difficult questions about its ecological role to avoid threatening its public support. The eagle is strong enough now to be discussed honestly. Its prey are being taken. Its competitors are being disrupted. Its presence is reshaping the behavior of other species across continental scales. Those are not problems to be managed away. They are the evidence that the recovery worked. But they are also facts that require honest acknowledgement if the management of the recovered ecosystem is going to be any better than the management that created the collapse in the first place. The indigenous dimension of the bald eagle's recovery is a thread that runs through the entire story, and that mainstream conservation narratives have been inconsistent about incorporating with the depth it deserves. Bald eagles hold profound spiritual and cultural significance for many indigenous nations across North America, and the species' collapse in the mid-20th century was experienced not only as an ecological loss, but as a cultural and spiritual wound by communities whose ceremonial practices, clan identities, and relationships with the land were tied to the eagle's presence. The recovery has been experienced in those communities as something more than a wildlife management success. It has been experienced as a restoration of relationship. Many tribes and First Nations were active partners in the recovery effort, conducting monitoring, participating in nest protection,